Hello, this is Russ Teston from AWS Educate. Thank you for joining the Supporting the Rapid Transition to Remote Learning webinar series from Amazon Web Services. Educators all over the world are rapidly transitioning to remote learning, some for the first time, and we wanted to do something to help ease the transition. This webinar series was created for educators, by educators who have expertise in remote learning and can share their insights with you. The series runs through May 1st, so check back on the website each Monday to view new webinar topics. You will be muted during this webinar, but we want to hear from you, so please put your questions into the questions panel of the GoToWebinar control panel. We will answer throughout the presentation and also have time set aside at the end to answer your questions. Note, this webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording one day after the webinar. You will also receive a certificate for attending this webinar. And with that, I'd like to introduce Jill West from Georgia Northwestern College to discuss supporting K-8 families. Jill?
Thanks, Russ. I appreciate the opportunity to contribute some thoughts and ideas on how to handle these challenges we're facing right now. Here's a quick overview of the points I'll touch on: staying connected with students, thoughts on how to teach remotely, ideas on how to support students and their parents, and some tips for working with tech tools. Now, clearly, I don't have a silver bullet to solve all the problems, but hopefully you'll find some pieces that will be helpful with specific problems that you're facing. I want to give you a little more understanding of the various perspectives I'm speaking from. My degrees are in psychology and elementary education. I actually added IT later in my career. I spent 10 years as a full-time parent and homeschooling my 4 kids. I've got 2 girls and 2 boys, ages 9 to almost 18. The oldest graduates next month. And during this decade, I was working part-time. Then about 8 years ago, my husband and I switched places, so he's now the full-time homeschooling parent. But because I work from home most of the time, I'm still overseeing their homeschooling from kind of a big picture perspective. These days, I teach IT both online and in the classroom for a 2-year technical college. I've transitioned my own classes to fully online for the remainder of the semester and now for the summer too. For my full-time work, I design and write content for multiple IT courses, most of which fully support online learning. We started designing courses for online learners at about the same time I started writing full-time, so we've been thinking this through for many years already. I'm also watching my own kids as their classes transition to fully online. Not all of homeschooling is done at home by the parents, and we'll talk some more about that here in a minute. So first, I want to talk about how do we stay connected with our students during this challenging time. I don't know about you, but this is a complicated challenge. We've never done this before. It's scary, it's frustrating and stressful, and our students and their parents are feeling a lot of these same emotions. So I think it's important that we have grace for ourselves, for our students, and for their families. There's going to be a lot of trial and error. It's really important to give ourselves time to work through this learning curve. So let's further define the learning curve we're facing. We keep calling this homeschooling, but what homeschooling really is includes visits to museums, area businesses, church activities, and outside educational resources. My own kids are part of a homeschool cooperative or co-op of about 100 families that work together to give the kids classroom learning activities and social outlets, and all of this is having to be transitioned to online instruction as well. So the term homeschooling is a misnomer. We don't actually spend an awful lot of time at home. This is more schooling at home, or trying to replicate regular school activities at home with parents filling in as surrogate teachers. But really, this is crisis schooling. We're all stressed from this global scale crisis. Parents aren't trained for this and weren't prepared, and they're also working from home and coping with their own challenges. Teachers, we haven't had time to plan for this. This isn't how we were trained. Our lesson plans and learning objectives aren't working the same way. The kids are feeling our stress, and many of these kids are experiencing challenging or abusive situations at home with little to no relief or community support. So this is not school as we know it. We're having to innovate moment by moment and find ways to connect with our students strictly from a distance. So what are some ways that we can reach across this distance? One thing you can do is send regular emails to your students. If your students don't have email accounts through school, there are kid-safe email providers out there that you can use for free. I did this with some of my kids when they were younger. You can also include your video feed during class calls so students can see you and have that kind of more personal connection with you. One of my favorite tools is to use discussion boards for anytime conversation. If you don't have a discussion board tool included in your LMS, your learning management system, there are online tools available that are free. I've seen that a lot of teachers are doing drive-bys to student houses. Maybe mostly this is for younger kids, but not necessarily. You just want something so they can see you and know that you're still out there and thinking about them. One thing I've done is virtual office hours for unstructured conversation. This way students can ask you questions or even just chat with each other. It provides a sense of connection with people outside their own households. Basically, what we're looking for is providing outlets for students to explore their emotional experiences through this and to experiment with self-care methods, and also find ways for you to check in regularly with them to see how this is going. So takeaways from this first short section is, as we're trying to cultivate a sense of personal connection, I think it's important to have grace for yourself, for your students, with their families, allow for our learning process while we're crisis schooling, and find ways to personalize and connect. So how do we do this? How do we teach this way when we can't be in our familiar classroom environments where we have all these support structures in place to try to optimize learning opportunities? As I design online learning activities, I shift my focus from synchronous teaching to asynchronous learning. Now, synchronous learning, this is what we're used to doing in the classroom. You teach everyone at the same time. Maybe you have them broken into groups, but you're still in the same place at the same time. This works great for lecture, structured projects, group work, that kind of thing. But asynchronous learning, this is how I design activities for distance learning students in the courses that I write. These activities can be completed anytime that fits the student's schedule, and it encourages independent learning. But this takes a mindset shift, so let's talk about what that means. With synchronous learning, there's a lot of emphasis on the teacher-to-student relationship, but with asynchronous learning, there's more emphasis on peer-to-peer relationships and two-way learning, maybe even with the teacher. I'll talk more about this as we go. Now, you might be familiar with the idea of flipping the classroom, by which I mean an instructional model where students initially learn concepts as their homework, and then they use class time to put those concepts to work and practice working with them. But how does that apply in an online learning environment? Synchronous instruction, the more traditional instruction model, requires stricter due dates that can be tracked in the classroom, more extensive lectures, and dedicated Q&A or question and answer time with the instructor and with the whole class. Asynchronous instruction relies more on a weekly cadence with flexible due dates. For example, maybe discussion board assignments are due on Thursdays, online work in the LMS is due on Sundays, and so on. You can also offer opportunities to submit work at a more flexible pace where possible. Maybe use due dates more as guidelines for self-pacing rather than as do or die deadlines, and then allow for multiple attempts based on your feedback. Design projects to allow for more independent work, and it's also helpful to give opportunities for more peer-to-peer discussion of topics. Now, many teachers do use recorded lectures in a flipped learning environment. When I include this as part of my instruction, which I sometimes do, I prefer to record live lectures with the students who do want to call in, and then I'll post recordings of those lectures for those who couldn't attend. This gives us better engagement because the students who are calling in will ask questions that the other students will have as well, and it also sets up a back and forth dynamic so it sounds more like a conversation rather than a lecture. You can also use more open-ended projects that emphasize autonomy and personal interests. It's important, though, that you write some really informative grading rubrics so that students understand what's expected of them in these open-ended projects. Now, as I coach students to take more ownership of their own learning process, I teach them a concept of metacognition. Metacognition means thinking about your thinking. So some people think in pictures, some people think in words, some people think more in abstract thoughts or movement or energy or colors or something like that. And as students are able to start to notice the way that they think and the way that's different from the way other people think, you can then direct that attention to their learning process and how we cycle from a place of not knowing into a place of knowing. So this learning cycle We start in the bottom left corner, and the critical step here is to identify what we don't know. So we can move from a place of I don't know what I don't know into a place of I know what I don't know. To do this, we have to identify the blind spots, so to speak, so we can know what we don't know and then figure out ways to learn that information using resources available to us. A flipped classroom and asking students good questions support that process. As we slowly move through the cycle, we can fill in our knowledge gaps and then practice to make that knowledge more automatic. As we get into the bottom right corner, we can use peer review and self-study to challenge ourselves into another round of learning. You can think about this cycle at both the micro and the macro levels. So we go through mini learning cycles with singular skills, and then we go through macro learning cycles over the course of a chapter or semester or school year. So metacognition is being aware of this process and recognizing the achievement of mastery through the completion of each cycle before moving on to the next thing. This increases intrinsic motivation. So we can draw awareness for students' progress by asking good questions, asking what they're thinking and how, and giving them space to engage uniquely with the material. Now, one of the best ways to develop metacognition is to take time for reflection. All of my lab assignments in my own classroom end with these two questions. What's something I learned, and what would I like to know more about? This lets students pause, step back, look at the blind spot they just filled in, and see what other blind spot they might now be aware of. With the courses I design, we build these kinds of reflective activities into our online courses as well, along with grading rubrics so that students and instructors understand better how to engage with these thought activities. I said earlier, discussion boards is one of my favorite activities for online learning. They offer an excellent platform for these kinds of reflective discussions in asynchronous learning environments. The key here is to ask really good questions in the discussion board assignments. So make sure that you're asking questions that Google can't answer. You might ask for opinions or experiences. You can set up opportunities for debates and peer feedback. You could even maybe have the class take a vote on grading policies or assignments or any other area where you can provide options. So this is kind of like asking a toddler if they want a red sweater or a blue sweater. Whatever choice the class comes up with is fine with you, but this gives students an opportunity to have their opinions count. It also helps to prevent trauma damage by giving students some control over their environment. Now, one thing I do with one of my classes, I'll give you an example. I'm teaching a databases class this semester, and the topic really isn't the issue, but one thing I like to do is challenge my students to play with their answers. So in this database class, I have them make a junk copy of a database file, and then I have them come up with their own questions to ask the database to form their own queries, and then they go in and they practice with that and see if the results they get is what they expected. So this kind of approach can be used with no matter the subject and no matter the grade level. Definitely doesn't have to be databases. But basically the idea is to get students in there asking their own questions and experimenting to see if they can get the results they're looking for. Now, like I said, there are discussion board tools out there. If you don't have a good one in your LMS, just be sure to comply with all legal requirements surrounding privacy and security. So takeaways from this section: provide flexibility through asynchronous activities, encourage thinking about thinking, and offer conversation through discussion boards. Now, with parents needing to fill in the gap between what we normally handle in the classroom and the reality of kids learning from home, how can we as teachers support these parents and their kids? So I don't know if you have any kids that are old enough yet, but think about what it's like to move to the passenger seat when your child is learning to drive. This is one of my daughters, Sarah. She's 16 and she's learning to drive. And I can tell you it is a scary thing to step out of the driver's seat into the passenger side and let her sit there behind the wheel and turn on that car and put it into reverse or drive or whatever it is. It's scary. You have to hand over the controls. You don't have access to the brake pedal or the steering wheel. This child you raised from wearing diapers now is taking your life into her hands. But if you're too stressed or fearful or controlling, you're going to stress out your budding driver too. It's important to show confidence in their ability to learn and handle challenges and remind them that If push comes to shove and something happens all of a sudden, they're going to have to make decisions on their own to handle fast-moving situations without further instruction from you. So think about if we're coming up to an intersection and somebody runs a red light. Whoever's in the driver's seat has to decide how to handle that situation very quickly, a lot faster than what you could possibly give instructions to her verbally. So it's kind of the same thing as we're working with our students through their parents. We need to think in terms of how to encourage, guide, and even empower parents in the teaching process. Now, perhaps we're a little bit more on the sidelines now because of the reality of the situation, but we still play a very critical role in providing professional guidance, organization, and direction through a cooperative coaching kind of relationship with parents. It might be helpful to think of parents more as teacher assistants or maybe surrogate teachers who are integrated into your classroom. You might even think about scheduling a training or coaching session, either live or recorded, to help build those parents' confidence. Now, it's tough because we're not writing lesson plans for the classroom now where we could personally guide our students' work. Now we have to write instructions that can be easily followed without our direct help, and this is hard. So we'll talk about this some more in a minute as well. The reality of the situation is that we just can't accomplish as much as we could in the classroom. We've got to scale back, we've got to reprioritize, and make sure we're hitting the core basics. Parents are working from home, or they're not able to work, or maybe they're working an essential job with crazy hours. Kids are cooped up, maybe they're babysitting siblings and having to share tech resources such as devices or bandwidth. We as teachers are dealing with many of these same stressors. Well, we can make this more doable for everyone if we can simplify and set realistic priorities. However, we're not completely alone in this. There are hundreds of resources being made available for this time. Maybe not tools that we're used to using, but there are many excellent tools available, and many of them are now free. Now, clearly, no matter how well we manage this transition as teachers, this won't work with a lot of parents who are either unwilling or incapable due to factors outside their control to help at this level. So let's talk about that for a minute. I don't know about you, but I'm working with a lot of different kinds of people, both as students and for their family members. The parents we're working with come from diverse populations, and I don't just mean in terms of income level or expectations for their children. Their own educational experiences affect their ability to support their children through this. Not all of these guardians or even the children's parents. Many of us are working with grandparents or even foster parents, and they come from all different kinds of backgrounds. Immigrants, military, high school dropouts, maybe they're taking their own college classes right now, or maybe they're dealing with their own learning disabilities and challenges. As we're coaching these parents and other guardians of our students, it takes a modified approach to work alongside adults in this way. Adult learners are different than child learners, and maybe that seems obvious, but think about we're trained to work with children, but now we need to adapt our skills to coach these adults. So how do we do that? One thing I've learned from teaching adults in a technical college environment, these are often adults who have returned to school after some time in the workforce. Maybe they're older and they bring a different perspective to the learning experience. When adults learn, they learn in the context of past learning experiences. This can be both contributive and disruptive. They also bring a real-world context. They have bills to pay, deadlines or work hours to manage, household duties, other children. They just can't dedicate hours each day to each individual child. They're also worried about the future, and they have their own mental picture of what that future needs to look like in terms of their own employment or their children's educational career, or maybe they're just trying to get through to the end of the month before the money runs out. We can all relate to that, right? When teaching children, we're familiar with the term pedagogy. This is the art of teaching children. Here, the teacher is the director with direct control over activities in the classroom. We might use a lot of extrinsic motivation, like stickers or grades, and there can be more of an emphasis on classroom management, how the kids are behaving. When we're coaching adults, it helps to think about this more in terms of andragogy, which refers to the art of teaching adults. Here, the teacher takes on more of a facilitator's role. Maybe we're more of a co-learner even as we work together with parents to figure out all of this crisis schooling stuff and what's going to work for all of us. we can cultivate an atmosphere of synergistic collaboration with parents. We can help parents recognize the big picture processes of learning and metacognition and help them to start thinking about the learning process itself. So what are some tips we can share with parents? This first one might seem a little silly, but think about how families are cooped up in a limited space right now. Even young children need to know they have their own space. Indoor tents, blanket forts, even large cardboard boxes can give kids that private space and sense of autonomy. I have a friend who recently cleared out a kitchen cabinet for her young child to create her own space, and this also adds an element of adventure while still staying at home. My kids' co-op, one thing they've recently been doing is scavenger hunts, even with the older kids. This gives a sense of purpose and helps them to connect what's in their inside world to the outside world and show those things off. Now, I added routines here because that can be helpful, especially for things the kids enjoy. Kids do need some structure, but it's important that these routines are loose and flexible, not rigid. You don't want schedules to drain available energy. As much as you can, allow flexibility in routines. Maybe even encourage each family and child to develop a routine specific to their personality and needs, recognizing that some people function best early in the day and others later in the day. This gives a sense of control over their own environment, which is a protective element when we're dealing with a traumatic crisis situation like this. Now, you can include elements that are consistent across the entire class, like scheduled calls, but try to design due dates with this flexibility in mind and place a greater emphasis, especially for younger kids, on having lots of playtime and free time with maybe even just a combined total of an hour or two a day for formal schoolwork. Now, I found in my own homeschooling that checklists actually allow more flexibility for the child to design their own day. They know what they need to do each day, but they get to choose when and how, and then there's a sense of accomplishment as they check off each item on their list. So I mentioned gamification here. This is one method of incorporating these checklists. It can be highly motivating for students to study or practice. I'll show you an example here in a minute. Also, I've had lots of questions over the years from parents concerned that they don't know enough to teach their kids. It's not really about what you know. It's helpful if parents can realize that they don't have to know all the answers. We can instead encourage parents to coach their kids on how to use resources to find answers for their own questions, help students to take ownership of their own learning process. So let's look at this in a little more detail. Socratic questioning is the technique of responding to questions with questions. The questions that students ask help us to understand how they're thinking. We can then build off of those questions by asking more questions that model high-quality curiosity. Remember that learning cycle we saw earlier? One of the most critical steps is identifying our blind spots. So we use questions to find those blind spots and then to direct our efforts to find answers. Now, high-quality questions link these blind spots with information that we already know, and this helps guide us to find the information we need. Clearly, not every question requires this kind of response, but parents might be surprised to learn they don't have to answer all their kids' questions. This kind of helps to take some of the pressure off of parents so they don't feel like they have to know it all. Give parents examples of questions they can ask their kids. What do I still not understand? What did I learn? What else would I like to know? For example, my kids used to ask the most random math questions. How many times have you heard, how much longer till we get there, right? Well, this was one of my favorites. I would point out the mile marker we were at and then tell them what mile marker we were going to and then ask them how much longer we've got. We'd then have a 5-minute conversation about it as they practiced doing math in their heads, and then they'd give their own updates every few miles after that. I found that kids can actually discover the concept of multiplication from these math conversations long before they normally encounter that concept in their schoolwork. Well, parents can do the same thing as you help them understand that getting the right answer isn't really the point. See, they're still locked in this fear of their own schooling where getting an A or passing the class was more important than anything else. But we can invite them into this learning process as guides for their children, help them to see that curiosity and asking good questions are more important than making sure they can provide the right answer to every question. Help them to prioritize the learning process so that the parents and their kids can have some space for organic discovery and curiosity. Now, this slide might seem to contradict the previous one, but I think it's especially important to minimize ambiguity in the way that we coach parents and in our instructions for learning activities. You can provide clear instructions that helps parents and their kids know what's expected. Now, you can reduce the overall workload and you can prioritize some kinds of learning experiences over others. But all along the way, parents and their kids need clear instructions from you. Now, this is a screenshot from one of the textbooks I've written. I suggest maybe you take a look at textbooks that you think give clear instructions for the kind of project you're creating. And bonus points if the textbook also models high-quality thinking questions along the way. And then notice features of the instructions that you like. For example, here you can see where I've used text formatting, a transition sentence, a very basic sentence structure. I'll usually add in some tips, and this helps make the instructions easier to read and understand. I'll also often add screenshots where needed to provide a visual guide along the way. If you're on a Windows computer, you can take a screenshot by holding down the Windows key, Shift key, and S key all at the same time, and it'll take a screenshot of whatever's on your screen. So takeaways for this section: coach parents towards success rather than taking on the full responsibility of success yourself. Encourage flexibility in the home, teach parents how to ask great questions, and then provide clear instructions. So how do we make all this work? Maybe you're not exactly a techie, and this can be a really scary proposition for you to have to guide your students and their parents into this world of tech-based engagement when you're not even comfortable with the technology yourself. So first, we're facing a very real challenge here with the digital divide between those who have access to technology and those who don't. In the interest of digital inclusion, how can we make these internet-based learning activities more accessible to all of our students? One thing you can do is use tools that can be accessed through a traditional phone line so that students can use a landline if needed. It's important to recognize that many of these students might only be able to call in on a smartphone, so they're watching whatever video there is on this tiny little screen. So try to minimize the amount of detailed graphics that you're showing on the screen. Also, there are a lot of community resources made available right now for free internet at home or free Wi-Fi hotspots throughout the community. Maybe look for some of those resources in your own area and then make sure parents are aware of all of their options. Additionally, many cell phone carriers are increasing or even eliminating data limits for now so that students and their families can use a smartphone as a Wi-Fi hotspot. So you might want to give parents instructions on how to do that for both an Android and for an iPhone. Some apps and videos and assignments can support activities that don't require a constant Wi-Fi connection. So maybe if you look for these kinds of activities and tools where maybe it requires just a brief Wi-Fi connection so parents can drive out to wherever there's a Wi-Fi hotspot in the community, connect just long enough to download or to install an app, and then go home and the students can work on their stuff at home even if they don't have Wi-Fi at home. Now, this is not ideal at all, but many schools are using the mail for sending hard copies back and forth for those students with absolutely no access to technology. As inadequate as that is, it can get us through the remainder of this school year. Then we can start campaigning for funds to provide every student with a computing device of some kind. I hope that you'll take comfort in knowing that every little bit helps, especially for those students in the worst home situations. So even if it's not anywhere close to ideal, at least it's better than nothing. Another area of concern is ADA compliance. Now, many online learning content providers already have built-in ADA supports, but as you're creating your own videos, you might want to think about posting those videos to an online tool like YouTube for automatic closed captioning. This also makes the videos available for students to view later at their own pace. You might even think about doing a little bit of research on how to increase ADA-style accessibility, such as using alt text, plain fonts, and color-agnostic formatting. So what are some tools we can use for tech-based engagement? We've been talking about these asynchronous tools and activities that allow for flexibility, but how do you learn how to use them? I would suggest you start learning like a techie does. I can tell you, most techies, we do not go take classes every time we got to learn something new because tech changes way too often for us to learn it in school. So instead, make friends with Google and YouTube and similar tools so that you yourself can take advantage of these asynchronous learning tools to teach yourself new skills. Also, you're going to have parents and students who are contacting you for tech support. I suggest that as much as possible, you direct them to formal tech support outlets so that providing this kind of support doesn't eat up your time. I realize that's not available for all situations, but if you've got some kind of tech support that's being provided through your school or even through these third-party providers like Microsoft or your learning management system, see if you can direct parents and students to those sources to get their help so that you're not having to spend so much time on that yourself. Now, before all this started, we were told, hey, screen time is not so great. Try to minimize screen time. But right now we're seeing that screen time can be a much more positive influence while we're cooped up inside our own houses. You can encourage social engagement through screen time while also talking about how to balance screen time with healthy digital lifestyle habits. So let's also look at ways to turn lemons into lemonade. Let's take advantage of this global connectivity right now. There are so many great digital resources being made available. Live streams, online conferences, video tours, free online training, free online access to library resources, and so on. If we can connect our students with some of those resources that would not have been so accessible from our classrooms, this can make this actually work to our benefit in some ways and not be only challenges that are making life hard. Another suggestion for this is a virtual show and tell. What about all those times that your students were asking you, hey, can I bring my humongous dog in for show and tell? Or I want my parents to meet all of my classmates, or I have these toys I want to show, or I just learned how to ride a bike and I want to show my classmates how I can do that. Well, now you can do that. You can say yes to these things because with a webcam or a smartphone camera, all I got to do is go take that camera and show you on a Zoom call or some other kind of video call that you're using so that students can show off what's going on in their lives at home. You can also invite guest speakers for online presentations and discussions. Think about all the professionals that are currently furloughed who would love to give a half hour or an hour of their time to support your students' education. Also look for ways to incorporate gamification. Now, obviously, we don't want to overly emphasize extrinsic rewards, and the game should not be the focus, but gamification done well can enhance a sense of intrinsic satisfaction for a job well done. For example, responsive leaderboards, a variety of badges that reflect a multitude of student strengths, and collaboration tools can be powerfully motivating and even socially connective across a computer screen, especially if you change it up from time to time. So this is a gamification app that my kid's music teacher started using for her students while she's teaching over Zoom. I just got to do all kinds of kudos to their teacher for figuring out how to teach piano lessons over Zoom. But all four of my kids are really loving this app. Even the 9-year-old will sit and practice his piano lessons for a half hour or more with absolutely no prompting from us. He just wants to see his name on the leaderboard. As you're relying on tech tools such as video calls, I thought I would also add in a few pointers for how to make these calls as engaging as possible. Provide almost constant audio. This means you're going to have to talk more, so have some water nearby or cough drops handy. And then provide connection by showing your video feed. However, audio is more important than video. So if your bandwidth is limited, it would be better to show your video just briefly at the beginning of the call and briefly at the end of the call, and then focus your bandwidth on getting some good quality audio through your network connection. You can record your calls for asynchronous viewing later and then post those recordings to YouTube or a similar site on an unlisted channel for privacy, and then that way you can get some automatic closed captioning. Now, if you are recording your calls and posting them, I wanted to add a few tips for the video making process. I've had to do dozens and dozens of videos over the years. Keep in mind this is not a Hollywood production. So, look straight into the camera when possible to simulate eye contact, but use your natural language. Don't rely too heavily on scripts. Also, don't over-edit your videos. First of all, this takes lots of time. And again, this isn't Hollywood. And then don't over-dramatize your videos. If you try to add lots of graphics or animations or bright colors, this can actually be more distracting and not very helpful. Don't ramble. If you notice yourself starting to drone on, well, that's hard enough to follow in a classroom, but it's even harder over a video. And then include variety. Change up your tone of voice, the focus of the conversation, the topic, the activity every few minutes. I found this is easier if I've got students live on the recording, even if it's only one or two, so that they can ask questions and then we have more of a conversational back and forth. Above all else, regardless of the tech you use or the challenges you're facing, it is all about relationship. We can catch our kids up later as needed once we're back in the classroom. As frustrating as this is right now, it isn't the end of the educational careers for most of these students. What's most important, though, is maintaining a functional relationship with each child so that when they are back in school, the trauma of this experience is minimized and the excitement and energy of coming back together will more than make up for the lost time. So takeaways from this section: use community resources to bridge the digital divide, make tech work to your advantage, keep it real on your videos, and prioritize relationship over all else. Thank you very much for allowing me to share on this platform, and thank you to every teacher out there for every bit you're doing to help support kids and their families through this challenging time. Now we've got some time for some Q&A, so Russ, I will hand it back over to you.
Thank you for sharing your expertise with us, Jill, and thank you to everyone for your active participation in the questions panel. We really appreciate all the questions and comments so far. As mentioned earlier, we will be hosting more webinars on remote learning and are also hosting office hours to answer any further questions you might have. You can find more information for both the webinar series and office hours on our webpage found on the screen and in the chat window. Also, a link to the recording of this webinar and a certificate of completion will be sent to you via email within 24 hours. Lastly, you will see a survey pop up when you close the webinar. Please provide your feedback on the survey so we can continue to improve these webinars. Now, let's continue to answer questions through the questions panel of the GoToWebinar control panel until the top of the hour.
Jill, that was super interesting. Thank you very much.
Oh, good. I'm glad it was helpful.
Yes, and thank you, Russ, for getting us going on that. This is Grant Irons with AWS Educate, and also want to thank everyone, like Russ said, for your participation through the questions vein. So if you do have any questions for Jill, please enter them in the questions pane. And while more questions are coming in, Jill, I actually have a couple of questions for you.
Okay, go.
One of the things you talked about was offering flexible due dates, or if I offer flexible due dates, how can I make sure that my students get their work done and turn it in?
Yeah, so that's a good question. If you start to loosen the reins on students, how does that look like when they're trying to figure out, well, does that mean I can put all of this off until the end of the semester? And I think part of the solution there is to build the relationship through the learning process. So some of the things I'll do, you can offer points incentives for timely work. You can talk about how procrastination is going to make your life harder if you keep putting off your work. You could use daily checklists, not just checklists for the whole week or something, but even every single day if you're making consistent progress towards whatever your due dates are. And then one thing that I really emphasize the most is building relationship through the learning process. So I'm sitting there with my students, working on projects that they need to be doing. I'm working with them to review for the tests that they've got coming up. So that helps to build their confidence and helps them to feel like that they've been prepared. So a lot of the times that we spend together in those synchronous video phone calls, I was actually surprised at when I asked my students when we first started this transition, do you want to have regular video calls together, or would you rather just work on this on your own time? And a whole bunch of them came back saying, I want to have these video calls. So we started spending the video calls working on the things that they need to be working on towards checking off the list, whatever assignments that they've got going. And I think if you use that opportunity to build that relationship, they're hitting their due dates without even realizing that was a do or die kind of deadline. Because I just don't, I'll accept work usually past the deadline. So I think it's more about relationship, like I said at the end.
Yeah, I've heard you say relationship about 10 times in that one paragraph, which was, that's fantastic. And I noticed that your last slide was relationship, which couldn't agree more. I know my kids who are in first and third grade really, really appreciate that FaceTime with their
Oh,
teachers.
yes, absolutely. Especially at those young ages. It's about let's sit there and have a chat. It's not
Yeah.
about let's give a lecture. Let's talk about show me your pet, show me your favorite toy, show me what
Mhm.
you've just learned, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good point. A question came in about working with parents. So after you have considered the parents and gotten them involved, how do you keep the momentum going, and how do you keep parents motivated?
Yeah, that's tough. I think parents are coming into this, they've kind of been slammed with this job, plus all of the extra stress that we're dealing with right now. I think one thing to do is to realize that we are serving parents as well. Normally, we think about our students are the kids that show up in our classroom, but right now we're working with the parents as well. And so some of these things, I think I mentioned that you could actually do a training session with your parents, or maybe even just a connection kind of session. Call in and chat and ask me your questions and let's talk about what's going on. I think that my experience in homeschooling, where I've had parents contact me after I'd been doing that for a few years, and they're saying, how do I do this? It just seems like it's so impossible. It's such a major task to undertake. And I remind them, you don't have to have all the answers to the questions. That a lot of times, if you can embrace your kids' questions and help them to connect with that sense of curiosity, we all have that seed of curiosity in us. And if we can tune into what the kids are experiencing with their curiosity and use that to help us continually, reconnect with that sense of curiosity ourselves, that's a way that you can engage in the learning process with your kids and not feel like you have to be the one that's got all the answers and you've got it all figured out.
I love it. I personally have a master's in education and an undergrad in business, and I still don't know everything in first and third
Right,
grade. So I
exactly.
appreciate you reminding me to give myself grace. And one of the things that I actually saw in your slides and you just talked about was the concept of training for parents, which is so important. I know personally, my kids' teachers have done a great job of providing those resources to us, and it's been super useful, as well as asking us how it's going. That was something that we really appreciated that came from one of the teachers the other day was a survey. Hey, what's working, what's not working? And then I know the feedback we gave, we saw changes the next day. So
Wow.
super valuable to have that relationship with the kids and a relationship with parents, just like you talked about.
Yes.
And go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, I'm just looking through some more questions.
Yeah, well, I wanted to add on, what else could we do to train parents if we're thinking in terms of what are we training them? So, like you're saying, providing the technical support so that they understand the tools that they're using, checking in with them. I think maybe we could even start talking about, for me personally, this is a super exciting interest that I have to understand learning science and education from the perspective of the psychological angle. How do our brains
Mhm.
work to learn? And so we can invite parents into that process. We can talk with them about things like Bloom's taxonomy. We can help them start to observe their kids from more of a teacher's perspective, because parents are coming from more the student perspective. That's been their experience with school, where they think the assignments are all about, I have to make sure that my kid does this well and that they turn this work in and it's good work so that they get a good grade. But then they're missing out on that bigger picture that we see as teachers, that drives our assessment practices, it drives our curriculum choices and designs and all of that. And that's that entire learning process. What are the kids learning? How are they engaging with the learning? How does that work for those kids? How are they moving from a place of not knowing into a place of knowing? And as we draw parents' attention to that process so that they can observe it from the teacher's perspective, they get the opportunity to really enjoy that process with their kids and not feel like this is so performance oriented, but it's more about the learning, the curiosity, the fun of learning something new and expanding our universes.
That's a great point and good for us as parents to remember. Heather commented, I've spent time calling parents from the first week we were off and have built great rapport with them. Our relationship is better now than it was before. That's really cool.
Oh, yeah,
And then I
absolutely.
feel like we've developed a real relationship that's genuine, which, we talk about that in education in general, and now it's even more important in the remote instruction setting. So Heather, good for you. That's awesome. Encourage everyone else to do that.
That's exciting.
Um,
Yeah.
So I want to move up to another question. Are there open source tools available for remote instruction? What have you been using? What have you found effective? And yeah, just give us your insight there.
Yeah, well, so I could go the curriculum direction or I could go the tech direction. Which one are you more interested in?
Just share a little bit of both if you don't mind.
Okay,
Great.
sure. So from the curriculum perspective, I've been working with this all through my homeschooling career. Homeschooling families get very resourceful to find tools to help them to teach their children. Something like if my kids are struggling with math, I'll have them go in and spend some extra time with something like Khan Academy. So there's so many tools available now, especially right now during this quarantine, that are being made available for free that weren't even free before, but all kinds of open source and free resources that students and families can take advantage of so that parents don't have to feel like they have to fill in all the gaps. And teachers don't either. We don't have to go in and create all of this from scratch. We can go find a lot of the resources that are available already online and pull those into our courses. Tools like Flipgrid, where they can, make their own videos and share those kinds of things. All of the video conferencing tools where we're connecting with our students with that video connection, all of that can be helpful. From a technical side, I think we run into challenges because you have to have a certain amount of hardware in order to take advantage of the software. And then you also have to have an internet connection. So I think it's important that we understand what options are available in our community and share those resources with our students and with their families so they can take advantage of those resources. A lot of times they're just not aware of what's being out there, especially if they've not had internet, then they're not seeing the announcements that are going out by email or through the school website or whatever. And so it might even take a written letter, that you send over the mail, very low tech to solve the tech problem. I had a student call in for a video call yesterday. He had not had internet all the way through the 6 weeks of quarantine, just finally got it last week for the first time. So a lot of these students, it's not that they're dropping off the face of the earth, they just don't have the internet connection. So we have to make sure that they've got the information they need to take advantage of these resources.
Hey, Jill,
Awesome.
thanks
Thanks
for
for
that.
that.
Hey, we also have one more question from Mohammed. It says, are there any specific tools that cater to the needs of special education children?
Yeah, I saw that question. I was trying to think about how to respond. Special ed is a special area of instruction that I'm not particularly trained in. I do have some interests of my own for personal reasons, but I would be speaking more from a personal perspective on that would be pretty limited. So for special ed, I think a lot of it, and I mentioned this in a response earlier in the question, a lot of it, again, has to be that relationship level. And so it's not so much necessarily trying to make sure they're hitting certain standards or performance levels. This is really about the relationship, and it can even be the relationship between the kids themselves, not just from teacher to student. But I realize there's a lot of limitations there because you don't have the infrastructure in place that we're so used to support those kids. And so it's taking a lot of creative thinking. I've been reading online some about some of the ideas that instructors are coming up with when they're faced with those special ed challenges. And there are some very creative and clever teachers out there. So if you can go out and do some of the research for what they're coming up with, excuse me, there's some great stuff out there.
That's a great point, and thanks for highlighting the fact that there are other resources out there for students with special needs and different needs. One of
Right.
those being ELL. We get a lot of questions about ELL and ESL, students that aren't native English speakers. And I want to pose that question to you to know if you are aware of anything. But before that, I want to highlight the fact that we're having a webinar next Friday on ELL for remote instruction. So if anyone is an ELL teacher, ESL teacher, or knows someone who could use some assistance, next Friday we have Morgan Nixon coming on to speak about ELL, and she has, I believe, her master's in ELL instruction, and so really good speaker. So do you have any experience with ELL?
Well, so in my classroom, we're in an area with a high number of immigrants, especially Hispanic immigrants. So I do get a lot of students in where English is their second language and they're just barely getting by with English. But for the remote instruction, I saw a session last week actually, and the tool that they were demonstrating was Microsoft Teams, but they were talking about their other tools as well that do similar things, where it does automatic translation. So it might actually be to the student's benefit in some ways to be learning remotely when English is not their primary language, because they can set up so that they're seeing the automatic translation. And the demonstration I saw, it was really good. It was doing a very fast job of putting it into either a closed caption in English or translating it to another language. And teachers on the session were actually talking about, oh, I'm going to have to figure out how to set this up on my projector in my classroom when we do get back on campus, so that those students who are struggling to understand me talking in English, they'll get the translation up on the screen to help clarify the information that they need. So there are some really amazing tools out there if you do a little bit of research on that.
That's a great point. And actually, AWS has Amazon Transcribe and Translate, which are machine learning tools that can help with that. Also, one of the things that we do with all of these webinars, so this is the second to last of a series of webinars over the past 4 weeks, and we have moved all of them, or in the process of moving all of them, to YouTube. And on YouTube, a little known feature is transcribing and machine translation. So all the webinars that we have done in the past and will continue to do in the future are going to be available on YouTube with that machine translation. So good point there.
Yeah, I've used the closed caption tool on YouTube. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's awesome, and it's machine transcribing. So people don't do it, but through automation, they've done a great job with that.
That's
Talking about videos, what's a good length for a video for students, whether it's asynchronous instruction where you're not in front of it, you're recording it, or synchronous where you're in front of the camera talking to them?
Yeah, so I've seen discussion on, well, your video shouldn't be longer than 5 minutes, or your video shouldn't be longer than 1 minute per grade. So like a third grader would have no more than a 3-minute video, something like that. I don't think that's necessarily directly relevant at all times. I've seen my 9-year-old, he's in third grade, they get on a video call with his classmates at their co-op, and they'll spend an entire hour totally engaged with their conversation. So I don't know that a time limit specifically is really where the focus should be. The focus really should be more on, is the time being spent in a meaningful way? And is it really connecting with the students? So something where there's a lot of conversation going back and forth, trying to put a time limit on that kind of a video is not going to be productive. But if you're just sitting there lecturing, then, 2 or 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 7 minutes, depending on the topic that's being covered and the amount of transition you're able to put in there to keep the variety, to help keep students engaged. You would want to limit recorded videos more, but for live calls, the time limit is going to be much less stringent. It's going to be a whole lot more flexible and just kind of go with the flow with however students are engaging. So one of my classes in particular, this is the hardware class where we're talking a lot about computer hardware, and it's a whole bunch of college age guys. And so you would think, well, they're going to want this to be limited and not last very long. I don't think any of those calls has lasted less than an hour and a half, because they just get so engaged and they're talking about it and it's continuing to be helpful. So as long as it's helpful, there's no reason to put a cap on it unless you have to go to another call for another class.
That's a good point. I know that my first and third grader have been on 30-minute plus webinars, and they enjoy it. It's that engaging part, which yes. I want to highlight. Talking about the webinars that we've done over the past month, there are some really good webinars on how to create videos that are engaging and how to engage students online. So if you want to go back and watch those, and I know, Jill, you could dive deep into that, but unfortunately we don't have time. We only have 5 more minutes. So want to refer folks back to some previous videos. Like I say, we only have 5 more minutes. So if you do have any questions for Jill, please put them in the questions pane of the GoToWebinar control panel. Also, I want to highlight the fact that there will be office hours directly after this. So you can go to the website where you signed up for this webinar, find the office hours section and sign up for an office hours that will start in 20 minutes and get a little bit more one-on-one time with Jill as well as several other educators. So Jill, do you see any questions that you would like to answer?
I got to talking and I stopped looking at the questions, sorry.
Completely understand. Well, while you're looking, I'll give you a second to look.
Yeah, I think we've addressed most of them, unless I'm just missing something.
Okay. I don't see any other that have come in, but I actually have one. So what are some other ways to help prevent trauma damage for kids during all of this?
Yeah, that's a really important question, I think, that we're all facing a trauma experience of some degree, and some of us more so than others. So if we look at the science, the therapeutic science of how to help kids process trauma, we need to talk about what's happening, bring it to the surface so it doesn't all kind of stay, subconscious. We need to normalize their experiences. A lot of people, when they're dealing with trauma, they think, oh no, I'm really weird with the way that I'm responding to this. And we need to help them know all those feelings you're having, it's all normal. It all makes sense for what you're facing. Communicate frequently, give clear instructions repeatedly as needed. Executive functioning is not ideal right now for really any of us. So if we need to keep giving instructions again and again, just recognize that's part of the space that we're in. Allow for performance variations that we wouldn't normally expect, address emotions directly, mirror those emotions back to students so that they know you see them and that they know they matter to you. Teach self-care skills, empower students by giving them opportunities to help where they can and options to make choices for themselves. I think one of the most important factors in protecting our kids from the effects of trauma right now is to empower them, to give them as much opportunity for making their own choices as we can within the structure of keeping them safe.
That's really good advice. And Jill, thank you so much. This has been super useful
Absolutely.
for me as a parent, and I know for teachers on the call. And have a great rest of your day.